In the silent highlands of the Andes, where wind sweeps across stone and sky meets earth in sharp clarity, a strange language danced on strings. Not written on bark or carved in clay, this language lived in knots. Twisted, colored, and arranged with precision, these chords held the voice of an empire. They were called Quipu, a system of knotted strings that recorded the thoughts, taxes, and lives of millions. No alphabet, no ink, just thread and memory. To touch one was to hold history in your hands. Yet no one today can read them. This is the story of the Inca's knot-based record system. Not just how it worked, but why it vanished, who tried to save it, and what secrets still hide in its silent tangles. Long before the Spanish came, the Andes were home to a vast and powerful empire. The Inca ruled over a land that stretched from modern-day Colombia to Chile. Their empire was not built on wheels or horses. It was built on roads, labor, and order. At its heart stood the Sapa Inca, the divine ruler who governed from the city of Cusco. Around him was a network of governors, priests, and record-keepers. These people managed food stores, counted soldiers, and collected taxes, but they did so without writing. There were no letters, no books, no paper. How then did they keep track of everything? The answer was the quipu. A quipu was made of a main cord. From this cord, many smaller strings hung down. Each string was tied with knots. The position, type, and color of the knots carried meaning. Some knots stood for numbers. Others may have stood for names, places, or events. The cords were made from cotton or alpaca wool. They came in many colors: red, yellow, green, blue, black. Each color had a purpose. A red string might mean war, a yellow one, gold, a green one, crops. The people who made and read quipus were called cupucamayos. They were trained from childhood. They memorized the patterns. They learned the rules. Their minds were like living libraries. They could recall the contents of hundreds of quipus. They traveled across the empire, carrying quipus in their hands or on their backs. When a governor needed to know how much corn was stored in a warehouse, the cupucamayos would read the quipu and tell him. When the Sapa Inca demanded a count of soldiers, the cupucamayos would unroll the cords and speak the numbers. This system worked across mountains and valleys. The Inca road network was vast. Runners called chasquis carried messages across it. They did not carry letters. They carried quipus. A chasqui would sprint from one station to the next, hand the quipu to another runner, and vanish into the distance. In this way, news moved fast. A rebellion in the north could be known in Cusco within days. A harvest report from the coast could reach the highlands in a week. All because of knotted strings. But the quipu was more than a tool. It was a symbol of power. Only the state could make official quipus. Only the cupucamayos could read them. The common people could not. To them, the quipu was mysterious. It was part of the sacred order. It linked the earth to the sun, the people to the gods, and the provinces to the Sapa Inca. To destroy a quipu was to break the chain of authority. To lose one was to lose memory. Still, the quipu had limits. It could record numbers well. It could track time, people, and goods. But could it record stories? Could it hold songs, prayers, or laws? Some say yes. Others say no. This is one of the great debates about the quipu. Did it carry only numbers, or did it carry language? We do not know for sure. No one alive today can read a quipu as the Inca did. We have over 800 surviving quipus. They sit in museums and archives. Scholars have studied them for centuries. Yet their full meaning remains hidden. We can read the numbers, we can see the patterns, but the words, the names, the events, the voices are gone. This mystery did not begin with us. It began with the arrival of the Spanish. In the year 1532, a small group of Spanish soldiers marched into the Inca Empire. They were led by Francisco Pizarro. They came from the sea. They brought horses, guns, and steel. The Inca had none of these. Within a year, the Sapa Inca, Atahualpa, was captured. The empire began to fall. The Spanish did not understand the Quipu. They saw cords with knots. They saw colors, but they saw no letters. To them, this was not writing. It was magic, or fraud, or nonsense. Some priests believed the quipus were tools of the devil. They said the Pucamayocs used them to deceive the people. Others thought they were simple counting devices, nothing more. In 1583, a Spanish priest named Cristobal de Molina wrote about the quipus. He said they were used to record history. He said the Inca told stories using the knots, but he did not explain how. He only said it was possible. In 1615, another priest, Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala, drew a picture of a Quipu Camayoc. He showed the man holding a Quipu, standing before the Sapa Inca. In the margins, he wrote in broken Spanish. He said the quipus held the laws, the taxes, the wars. He said they were sacred. He begged the Spanish king to respect them. But the Spanish did not listen. Instead, they destroyed quipus. In 1583, the Third Council of Lima declared that quipus were idolatrous. They said they belonged to the old religion. They ordered them burned. Priests went from village to village. They took quipus from temples and storehouses. They threw them into fires. Thousands vanished in smoke. The Quipu Camayocs were silenced. Some were killed. Others were forced to convert. Their knowledge was not passed on. The young were taught to read and write in Spanish. They were taught to use paper and ink. The art of the Quipu faded. Yet not all quipus were destroyed. Some were hidden. Some were forgotten in remote storehouses. Others were taken as curiosities by Spanish officials. These are the ones we have today. In the 19th century, scholars began to study them. They noticed patterns. They saw that the knots followed a decimal system. A single knot might mean 10. A long knot with 4 turns might mean 4. A space between knots might mark the difference between units, tens, and hundreds. This part was clear. But beyond numbers, confusion remained. Why so many colors? Why different types of cords? Why were some quipus buried with the dead? Why did some have no knots at all? In the 20th century, an American anthropologist named Marcia Asher studied quipus with her husband, Robert. They examined over 200 quipus. They found that the knot patterns were not random. They followed rules. They also found that some quipus had the same sequence of knots, even when found in different places. This suggested they carried standardized information, perhaps census data or tax records. But still, no words emerged. Then, in the 1990s, a researcher named Gary Urton began a new study. He collected data on every known quipu. He built a database. He looked for patterns in color, fiber, knot direction, and cord attachment. He believed the quipu might be a binary system like a computer code. Each choice, color, fiber, knot type, could represent a bit of information. Urton also studied a set of quipus from a village called Puruchuco. These quipus were found in a burial site. They came from 3 levels: a local warehouse, a district center, and a regional capital. The quipus from each level were different. The local ones had fewer cords.
The regional ones had more. The data flowed upward like reports. This showed the quipu was part of a bureaucratic system. But Urton wanted more. He wanted to find meaning. He looked at the names of places and people recorded by the Spanish. He tried to match them to patterns in the quipus. In one case, he found a sequence of 7 chords that appeared in several quipus. He thought it might stand for the name Pachacuti, a famous Sapa Inca. The number 7 might have been a symbol for the ruler. The colors might have spelled the name in code. This was a bold idea, but it could not be proven. No one could verify it. The link between the knots and the spoken language was still missing. Another researcher, Sabine Hyland, traveled to the village of San Pablo in Peru. There, she met elders who still used quipus for local records. These were not Inca quipus. They were modern ones, made in the last 100 years, but they followed old patterns. The people called them quipus. They used them to record community decisions, debts, and festivals. Hyland recorded the meanings. She learned that color and knot position still mattered. She found that some chords stood for people, others stood for animals. The system was not just numbers, it carried stories. But even this did not solve the ancient mystery. The colonial quipus were simpler. They did not have the complexity of the Inca ones, and the knowledge was fading. The elders were old. The young did not care. So the question remains, was the quipu a writing system? Some say yes. They point to the Spanish accounts, they cite Guamanpoma's drawings, they note the regional patterns. They argue that a system this complex must have carried more than numbers. Others say no. They say the quipu was a mnemonic device, a tool to help experts remember what they already knew. The real information was in the mind of the quipu Kamayok. The quipu was just a reminder. This debate is not just academic. It touches on deeper issues. What is writing? Must it use symbols on a flat surface? Can a three-dimensional object carry language? If the Inca had a form of writing that did not look like ours, should we call it less valid?
These questions matter because they shape how we see the Inca. Were they a civilized empire with a full record system? Or were they a pre-literate society that managed complexity without writing? The truth may lie in between. We know the quipu was used for administration. We have proof of this. Spanish records show that after the conquest, the colonists still used quipus to collect taxes. They did not trust the native people to write in Spanish, but they trusted the quipu Kamayaks to read the chords. So the system lived on, even under foreign rule. We also know that quipus were used in rituals. Some were buried with the dead. Others were placed in temples. Some had no numerical value at all. They were made with care, but their knots did not follow counting rules. These may have held prayers, myths, or genealogies. There is also evidence that quipus were used to record time. The Inca had a calendar. It was based on lunar and solar cycles. Some quipus may have tracked festivals, planting seasons, or tribute deadlines. A quipu could mark the passage of years, not just the count of goods. But the biggest challenge is the lack of a Rosetta Stone. For Egyptian hieroglyphs, we had the Rosetta Stone, a text in 3 scripts that allowed us to decode the symbols. For the quipu, we have no such key. We have no bilingual text. We have no quipu with a written translation. We do have one possible clue. In the 17th century, a Quechua speaker named Felipe Guamanpoma de Ayala wrote a letter to the King of Spain. He included drawings of quipus. He labeled some of them. He said one stood for war, another for peace, another for tributes. But his labels were in Spanish. He did not explain how the knots conveyed those meanings. So we are left with fragments. We know the quipu was central to Inca life. It was not a minor tool. It was a pillar of the state. It allowed the empire to function without writing.
It held data across 2,500 miles of rugged terrain. It survived earthquakes, floods, and wars. But it could not survive the Spanish conquest. The destruction of the quipus was not just physical, it was cultural. The Spanish replaced the system with paper. They replaced the quipu Kamayax with scribes. They replaced Quechua with Spanish. They replaced memory with print. In this shift, something was lost. Not just data, but a way of thinking, a way of knowing. The quipu was not just a record. It was a performance. To read a quipu was to touch it, to move the chords, to speak the values. It was an act of memory and voice. Paper was silent. It did not require training. It did not demand presence. The Inca understood this. They believed knowledge was alive. It lived in people. It was passed from teacher to student. It was tested in ritual and service. The quipu was part of that chain. When the Spanish broke the chain, they did not just end a system. They erased a worldview. Yet, the quipu did not vanish completely. In the highlands, in remote villages, some families kept old chords. They did not know how to read them, but they treated them with care. They passed them down. They said the knots held the voice of the ancestors. In the 20th century, archaeologists found quipus in burial sites. They were placed near the hands of the dead. Some were wrapped in cloth, others were tied to bones. These were not records of tax. They were personal. They may have held names, life events, or prayers. One quipu, found in the Andean village of Carhua, had 95 chords. Each chord had a unique color and knot pattern. It was not used for counting. It was too complex. Researchers believe it may have recorded a family's history, births, deaths, marriages, migrations. Another, from the coast, had chords made of human hair. This was rare. Hair was sacred. To use it in a quipu meant deep meaning. Perhaps it was a memorial. Perhaps it was a vow. These finds suggest the quipu was more than a state tool. It was also a personal one. It carried identity. But without the quipu Kamayax, the meaning is frozen. Today, scholars continue to study the quipus. They use computers. They map patterns. They compare chords. They hope to find a key. Some believe the answer lies in the way the knots are tied. A knot can be tied to the left or the right. This might change its meaning. The spin of the fiber, S-twist or Z-twist, might also matter. The attachment of the cord, looped, knotted, or spliced, could carry information. Urton's database includes all these details. He calls it the Quipu Database Project. It is the largest collection of quipu data in the world. He invites others to contribute. He believes that with enough data, patterns will emerge. Not maybe full sentences, but codes, symbols, names. Others are not so sure. They say the context is gone, the culture is gone, the readers are gone. No amount of data can replace a living tradition. And yet the search continues, because the quipu is not just a puzzle, it is a symbol. It stands for a civilization that built an empire without writing, that managed millions with chords and memory, that trusted trained minds over printed pages. It also stands for loss, for the cost of conquest, for the silencing of knowledge. And it also stands for hope, that even in silence, something remains, that a knot in a string can outlive an empire, that memory can survive in fiber. We may never read the quipus as the Inca did, but we can respect them, we can study them, we can admit that we do not know. And in that not knowing, we find a deeper truth, that human ingenuity takes many forms, that writing is not one thing, that knowledge can live in many ways. The quipu is gone, but it is not forgotten. It hangs in the air of the Andes. It lives in the hands of the few who still remember. It waits in the museums, in the soil, in the stories. It is silent, but it is speaking. And if we listen closely, we might still hear it. The origins of the quipu are lost in time. No one knows who made the first knot. No one knows when it began. But we know it was old, older than the Inca. Before the Inca, there were other cultures in the Andes. The Wari, the Tiahuanacu, the Moche. They built cities. They made art. They traded across long distances. Some of them used cords with knots. Archaeologists have found knotted strings in sites that date back to 2500 BCE. These are not quipus. They are simple cords with marks. But they show that Andean people used fiber to record information long before the Inca. By 600 CE, the Wari Empire used a system of knotted cords. They ruled a large area in the highlands. They built roads and storehouses. They needed to manage goods. They used quipus, or something like them. Fragments of cords with knots have been found in Wari sites. They follow patterns. Some have colors. Some have multiple strings. They may be early forms of the quipu. When the Inca rose to power in the 1400s, they may have borrowed the idea, or they may have developed it on their own. Either way, they perfected it. The Inca did not invent the quipu, but they made it essential. They built the largest empire in the Americas. They ruled over 12 million people. They spoke Quechua. They worshipped the sun. They believed the Sapa Inca was a son of the god Inti. To govern such a vast land, they needed order. They divided the empire into 4 parts, called suyus. Each suyu had a capital. Each capital had governors. Each governor had quipu camayaks. The quipu camayaks were not just accountants. They were scholars. They were trained in Cusco in special schools. They learned mathematics, astronomy, and state rituals. They memorized laws and genealogies. The quipu was their tool. They used it to count everything: people, llamas, corn, cloth, gold. They recorded births and deaths. They tracked labor duties. They noted crop yields. Every year, the quipu camayaks visited the villages. They conducted censuses. They updated the quipus. They sent reports to the capital. The system was accurate. The Inca had no money. Their economy was based on labor and storage. Each family owed work to the state. In return, the state provided food in times of need. To manage this, they needed numbers. The quipu gave them numbers. A quipu could have dozens, even hundreds of cords. Each cord stood for a category. 1 cord for maize, 1 for potatoes, 1 for soldiers. The knots showed the quantity. The Inca used a base 10 system. A knot near the top of the cord meant hundreds. A knot in the middle meant tens. A knot at the bottom meant units. A space between knots marked the difference. They used 3 types of knots: a single knot for tens, a figure 8 knot for 1, a long knot with turns for numbers through 9. Colors mattered. A red cord might mean soldiers, a white one, silver, a brown one, potatoes. The combinations created meaning. The cords were made from spun fiber. The direction of the spin, S or Z, might have carried information. The way they were attached to the main cord, looped, tied, or braided, might also matter. All of this required training. The quipu camayaks spent years learning. They had to memorize the codes. They had to practice knotting. They had to travel and report. They were trusted. They were respected. They were part of the elite. But they were also controlled. They served the state. They did not own the quipus. The quipus belonged to the Sapa Inca. When a Quipu Kamayak died, his knowledge died with him. There were no books to pass on. The system relied on living memory. This made the quipu fragile. It was strong in peace, but weak in crisis. When the Spanish arrived, the system began to break. Pizarro did not understand the quipus. He saw them as odd. He took some as curiosities. He gave others to his men. But he did not see their value. The priests who followed him were more dangerous. They saw the quipus as idols. They believed they held pagan power. In 1583, the Third Council of Lima banned them. Priests went on missions. They entered temples. They found quipus hanging on walls. They found them in storehouses. They burned them. The Quipu Kamayaks were forced to convert. They were told to abandon their old ways. Many did. Some hid their quipus. Some destroyed them to protect their people. Within a generation, the system was gone. But not all knowledge vanished. Some Spanish officials saw the value of the quipus. They used them to collect taxes. They kept the Quipu Kamayaks working, but under new rules. In the 1570s, the Spanish conducted a census. They used quipus to count the native population. The data was later written down. This is how we know the quipus were accurate. But after that, paper took over. The Spanish built archives. They wrote everything down. The quipu faded. By the 1800s, it was nearly extinct. Yet, in small villages, the memory lingered. Elders told stories of the knotted cords. Some families kept old quipus in boxes. They did not know how to read them, but they knew they were important. In the 1800s, explorers began to collect them. They took them to Europe. They sold them to museums. They called them curiosities. Scholars studied them. They saw the numerical patterns. They confirmed the decimal system. But they could not go further. In the 1900s, new tools arrived: radiocarbon dating, microscopy, databases. Researchers began to see details: the fiber type, the dye sources, the knot symmetry. They found that some quipus used alpaca wool. Others used cotton. Some came from the coast, others from the highlands. The materials told stories of trade and origin. They also found that some quipus had errors: a knot in the wrong place, a missing cord. This suggested they were made by humans, not machines. They were part of a living system. But the big question remained: did they carry language? No one could prove it. Until today. The search continues. Because the quipu is not just a relic. It is a riddle. And the Andes are still waiting for an answer.